Hello and welcome to our live cast. Today I want to give a preamble on supply chain excellence in advance of our webinar that we're going to have next week, which will outline the Supply Chains to Admire research. The Supply Chains to Admire research is in its 7th year and looks at which companies have driven improvement in performance while driving value. We look at the years of 2010 to 2018, and we study 600 companies. They have to be public, and they have to have results that are in the public domain for the period of 2010 to 2018. But today I want to go through some preliminary data on what defines supply chain excellence, and then talk about the Gartner Top 25 and compare it to the standard of driving improvement while outperforming the peer group and driving value, to give you some background for the session next week. So let's get started. My name is Lora, and I'm a social scientist of sort of look like this, sitting at my desk every day. I basically write for the business leader, focus on the supply chain leader, and I'm trying to figure out how people improve value, make choices in the right processes, align organizations, and select talent and systems to be able to drive differentiated outcomes. I've been in the space a long time, started in manufacturing for consumer product greats like Procter & Gamble, Clorox, General Foods, now a division of Kraft, which got purchased by Heinz, and Dreyer's Ice Cream, now a division of Nestle. Then I built software and then was an analyst at Gartner Group. Then I was an analyst at AMR Research, and when Gartner bought AMR, then I went to basically forge my own path and start my own company. I'm followed by 308,000 people on LinkedIn, and about 18,000 people read my blog each week. I've been at this for 7 years, blogging each week, and it's really a lot of fun. Today, I want to share with you some research and set the stage for what drives supply chain excellence. You know, when we ask supply chain leaders, and this is from recent research, is their supply chain working well? You can see that only 45% believe that their supply chain is working well. Most organizations are working in independent silos. They're not aligned, and it's a very reactive environment. People want it to be much more proactive and much more aligned, and you can't get there without driving alignment and metrics. So we have traditional practices, and supply chain was defined in 1982 as source, make, and deliver working together to drive customer value. But that's not what happens in real life. In real life, we have functional silos, the source, make, and deliver, that each operate within its own silo to drive efficient supply chains that aren't very effective. These efficient silos don't drive business value. And we define business value in our research as either market capitalization or price to tangible book. In 2012, when I started the company, I did some work with Arizona State University to look at the correlation of portfolios and metrics to market capitalization. And at that time, I found a correlation between the combination of growth, operating margin, inventory turns, and return on invested capital. So today, we are going to focus on those metrics as a proxy to be able to drive value. And we'll show you that the intersection of these metrics is not linear. In fact, it's usually a pretty wild ride, much like what you see at some amusement parks, unfortunately. And why is this important? Well, organizational silos are not aligned. In fact, here in this slide, you can see that new product launch and supply chain have big gaps. People don't know how to align new product launch and supply chain. Things like attribute-based forecasting or network design and stage gate processes, or product portfolio rationalization or platform rationalization are concepts that are difficult for a lot of supply chains, but managing complexity is really important to driving value. And so getting at that intersection of supply chain and product development is so important. I remember just the amazing savings that Campbell's was able to get when they rationalized 33 different cuts of carrots down to 3 because they wanted to rationalize the platforms and simplify the ingredient lines while making sure that they were meeting customer expectations. They found that customers really only cared about 3 cuts of carrots, and they had 33. And I got to tell you, we got a lot of that going on in this world. I went to visit a manufacturer of fine liquor the other day, and they have 198 package sizes of the same vodka. Now, some of those will be worthwhile in certain markets, but some of them are just overkill. So the management of complexity is a big drag on supply chain performance and will degrade value. And then you can see that sales and operations planning is so important, and sales and operations are not aligned. And companies that tend to do better on the balanced scorecard that we're going to talk about are good at sales and operations planning, and they align sales and operations. They don't make the mistake of asking sales to forecast, because they know that sales forecast will give us the highest bias and error. And they make sure that they're partners with sales to be able to drive on-time delivery and supply reliability. Also, operations and IT are often lacking alignment, which requires us to really get on the same page to define supply chain excellence so that our technology business partners can help us to drive and deliver our vision. I gotta tell you, I've been doing this research for 2 decades. This picture stays the same. We are not aligned as an organization because we measure functional efficiency, and our measurements are very much around siloed measurements within source, make, and deliver. So to align, we need a balanced scorecard. We need to focus on year-over-year growth. We need to focus on profitability, which I use operating margin as a proxy for that. We need to balance our cycles, and I use inventory turns as a proxy for that. And we need to manage complexity, which I look at return on invested capital, all while balancing customer service. Now, in the work we do on the supply chain to admire, we cannot find an industry measurement for customer service. So we look at the balance of the balanced scorecard metrics, and we look at how companies are doing on the effective frontier. Now, when I wrote a book in 2012 called Bricks Matter, I believed on the 30th anniversary of supply chain management that we had spent 1.7% of revenue on information technologies, and we had driven improvement at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns. And in fact, the supply chain leader stands at the intersection of customer service, inventory turns, and operating margin. This is the area and the domain which they have to really lead teams to be able to drive effective performance. But I was wrong, and I'll show you some of the amazing profiles of how companies have not been able to make improvement. In fact, only 1% of companies have been able to drive improvement while outperforming their peer group, and 99% of companies believe that they're making progress. So it's irony to me that, we have this belief we have best practices when we really don't. So let me give you some proof points. Here's some inventory analysis. And if we look at 2014 to 2018 as shown in the slide, you can see that our inventories have ballooned, and they've ballooned across all industries. Now, people might say, well, why? And I say, well, 5 reasons, right? We're more global, we have more in-transit inventory, our product lines are more complex, our tails of the inventory are longer, we're managing greater complexity, both in globalization and product portfolio rationalization. But also, supply and demand volatility have increased, and our technologies have not been able to keep up with the modeling that's really required because of the increase in volatility. We've also seen a decline in talent and the ability to do planning, and we lack leadership to be able to understand form and function of inventory. Most of our work has been focused really on safety stock, not on form and function of inventory. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means, but essentially it says, at what place should I put the inventory, and what form should the inventory be, and how much inventory should be in transit, and how do I minimize cycle stocks, and how do I make sure that I have the right seasonal inventories and the right promotion inventories to be able to maximize customer service. So the traditional tools have only focused on safety stock, which is really given demand and supply volatility, how much should I hold in distribution? It's not sufficient for us to be able to manage inventory, and inventory is our most important buffer in the supply chain today. Now, this is an example, Ross Stores, and I'll give you a hint. Ross Stores wins the Supply Chain Zone Meyer Award this year. And you can see in the green box, and we have all of these industry averages in green boxes in our slideshow today, that the industry average is 10% margin and 4.51 on inventory turns. And Ross beats the industry average of 0.10 or 10% and 13%, and their turns are higher. So if you remember, you want to have turns higher to really drive improvement in working capital. So Ross Stores inventory turns are 5.84 against an industry average of 4.51. But more importantly, look at the pattern. The pattern is one of improvement over the last 8 years. So this is an example of a company that is driving improvement while outperforming the peer group and managing both performance and improvement. It's a hard thing to do. Now, this is Packaging Corporation of America. They're also a winner in our Supply Chains to Admire. And they are driving improvement over the last 4 years, but you can see they had a little bit of a dip in the 2005 to 2006 period. And, you know, some of that is just rearranging the organization for some management changes and some reconfiguration. But when you compare PCA, which is the acronym for the company, to the peer group for the industry, you can see that they're clearly outperforming the industry average. Containers and packaging have an industry average of 9% of operating margin, and PCA has 13% operating margin. And they also have a higher inventory turn. Again, we want higher inventory turns. PCA's 6.90 on average, and containers and packaging is 6.4. So these are examples of companies that are driving improvement while also outperforming their peer group. It can be done. And I want to bring back this concept that it can be done because I'm going to show you a lot of companies that are not able to. No company in the Gartner Top 25 is able to drive improvement and outperform the peer group, and I'll show you that in a minute. So one of the things you do in supply chain excellence is you look at the profiles of the orbit charts, and these dots are really year-over-year plots at the intersection of two metrics because the supply chain is a complex nonlinear system. And you can see that Boston Beer is going backwards. Boston Beer, craft brewery, elongation of the product portfolio, growing, not able to keep up at a process level with the changes in complexity. Monster, on the other hand, has a 30% margin, so that versus a 16% margin of the peer group, and turns slightly above the average for the peer group at 5.5 versus 5.43. So this gives you some examples. I first showed you a company, an orbit chart of a company that is outperforming. Then I showed you a company that's outperforming and compared it to an orbit chart of its peer group. And then I showed you an example of how you can use the methodology to compare two companies, Monster and Boston Beer. Now, let's look at some companies that are not driving effective behavior. So BASF is going backwards. BASF is still above the average for operating margin. The average is 7%. BASF is 10%, but you can see that over time they have lost inventory advantage to the market and they are falling under the inventory turn average and they're going backwards. Likewise, AkzoNobel is going backwards while they are still slightly above the chemical averages. They are not sustaining improvement. Then you get other comparisons. This is Dow and BASF. Dow is making improvement. BASF is going backwards. Dow, however, is not at the industry peer group, And so you go through this one after another. Novartis and Merck. Wow, look at this pattern. Just such out of control companies. This is a good example of the lack of consistent supply chain definition, which sends the company in lots of different directions. So the pharmaceutical company average for this period was 19% profit margin, 2.75 turns. And you'll notice that every industry has a different profile. And so it's so incredibly simplistic and stupid to put all companies in a spreadsheet and shake them up. You just can't compare a pharmaceutical company to a consumer products company to a semiconductor company on a spreadsheet. It really requires us to understand the rhythms and cycles of the industry. So Novartis, you can see, is at the average of profit margin, slightly under the inventory turns. Merck is under the profit margin, but over the inventory turns. So companies struggle to maintain consistency at this intersection. And now let's look at Smucker's and Kraft. Wow. Kraft Heinz has gone through so many acquisitions, as has Smucker's. So 10% margin for food. You can see both of these companies are outperforming on margin, and 7.07 on average for inventory turns. And you can see both of these companies are not performing at the industry average. However, they're driving improvement, but Kraft Heinz lacks the resiliency of Smucker's. They're not able to drive incremental improvement. The best performing companies will show small gains in a consistent pattern over many years versus the wild swings that you see in the Kraft Heinz outline. All right, with that as a background, that we're going to define supply chain excellence as the ability to outperform in value, which that is either market capitalization or price to tangible book, while driving improvement. So we're using the orbit charts to drive improvement and outperforming the peer group. I want to just tell you that there are no companies in the Gartner top 25 using that definition that outperform their peer group while driving consistent improvement in their metrics performance. And I'm going to show you the examples. We're going to go through them one by one. Here's Coca-Cola. So you can see that Coca-Cola is a higher profit margin at 24% versus 16%, and they're slightly above on inventory turns. But look at the pattern. It's not a consistent pattern, and they've only been able to drive some improvement in the period of 2016-2017, but they struggle at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns. Here's P&G. P&G lost their way with the Gillette acquisition and some of the other acquisitions. They shed some of their acquisitions, and they've made a lot of improvement 2017 to 2018, but you can see that it is not that linear pattern of ROIC that I showed you, but P&G is outperforming the peer group at 19% margin and 6.4 inventory turns. Unilever has made recent progress, 2016 to 2018. You can see prior to that, the focus was primarily on inventory turns, and that we are able to hold the margin here at 16% and slightly increase the inventory turns at 6.96. So recent progress, but not consistent improvement. L'Oreal had a pattern of consistent improvement up until 2015, but you can see they've struggled with inventory turns with the rise of complexity, but they're still above the margin for personal products, 17% operating margin versus the industry average is 7%, and they still have slightly better turns, even though they've had a recent dip in the performance of the company and lacking consistency. Same thing with Colgate-Palmolive. Colgate-Palmolive has always had very high margin. Here they're posting 24% margin for the period of 2010 to 2018 against an industry average of 16%. Their turns are 5.22 against an industry average of 4.82, But look at what's happening, in 2018, 2017, 2016. They've lost a lot of headway on the ability to balance inventory turns and operating margin, and they're going backwards on the orbit chart. So those are some examples. Those were companies that were driving recent improvement, but they're not able to outperform the industry on both the metrics of operating margin and inventory turns. Typically, they will outperform on one, but not both. So now I'm going to show you some recent progress, but underperforming to their peer group. Here's Schneider Electric. Schneider Electric is at the profit center level, but underperforming in inventory turns, but they've driven some recent improvement. Home Depot, similar, love the improvement profile of Home Depot. They're above on profit center and operating margin, and they're also slightly under on inventory turns. Here's PepsiCo. PepsiCo is performing slightly under on operating margin and overperforming on inventory turns, but they did have a pattern of improvement up until 2016, and they're starting to come backwards. Nestle has recent improvement with the period of 2016 to 2018. They are outperforming on operating margin at 16%, underperforming on inventory turns. So you can see that it's very hard for companies to draw this balance. Starbucks has improved inventory turns, but they're not at the restaurant average, but they have outperformed in margin. Adidas, you can see, is underperforming on both metrics, and they've only recently driven improvement, 2016 to 2018, but they're not at the level of the industry. Diageo, driven some recent improvement, 2016 to 2018, but as you can see, they're really under on inventory turns and they're over on margin. Some of that is due to the fact that their products tend to be higher margin and slower moving, but you can see that it's hard for Diageo to make improvement. So we started with which companies have performance but not able to drive improvement. Then the companies that had made recent improvement but were still struggling with performance and improvement. And now I'm going to show you the companies that are treading water. Here's Samsung. Samsung is under in margin and also under in inventory turns, and you can see the big slide from 2006 to 2017. Cisco lost a lot of ground 2017 to 2018 with the redefinition of the market, and you can see that they are not at the margin level, but they're over on inventory turns. Here's Intel. Intel has gone backwards in the period of 2012 to 2018. They were previously a strong performer prior to the recession. Some of the redefinition of the semiconductor industry has been difficult for Intel to maintain margin. Here's pharmaceuticals. Novo Nordisk is the strongest performer in the pharmaceutical sector, but you can see while they are outperforming in margin, they're underperforming in inventory turns, and they made a lot of progress through 2016, but the period of 2017 to 2018, they are not making progress. All right, so those are examples of companies that had basically treaded water. You see circles that are not moving in a linear progression. Now, the companies that are not making progress at all are BMW. While BMW is higher in the margin area, less than the industry average in turns, you can see that it is a pattern that is going backwards. Same thing with AkzoNobel. AkzoNobel is higher than the industry average in both metrics, but not driving improvement. Same with BASF, as I covered before. H&M going backwards, and you can see 2010 to 2018, and you see this slide a lot in apparel retail as companies have struggled to keep up with the Amazon effect. Here's Nike. Again, Nike is going backwards, a big impact of 2016 to 2018 as they've struggled with digital transformation and the Amazon effect and greater competition in footwear. Johnson & Johnson. So you might say, well, is Johnson & Johnson a pharmaceutical company, a medical device company, a household products company? They're all three. And so I've given you the three averages for the orbit charts. But let's start with the orbit chart pattern. You can see that Johnson & Johnson is not driving improvement. And in fact, in the period of 2012 to 2018, you can see that we just are really not able to drive improvement at Johnson & Johnson. Now, when we look at the averages, you can see that the averages are above the industry average for pharmaceuticals, but under on medical device for the ability to manage inventory, and not meeting the household product standard for the industry average for inventory turns. So are we able to outperform peer group at J&J? I think it might be part of J&J that outperforms the pharmaceuticals, but I think in medical device and household products, we've got some discussion, but the pattern of J&J bothers me, and the fact that it's a backwards facing pattern. Here's HP. Look at HP in the downward slide. Clearly not a supply chain to admire. Let's look at Inditex, and this is the Zara parent. Again, big downward slide as Inditex has struggled with the Amazon effect. So we've taken all of the Gartner top 25, and as you can see, no company on the Gartner top 25 outperforms the peer group while driving improvement. And we've grouped them into the categories of recent progress, treading water, backward slide, so you can see the definition of supply chain excellence. Now, you might be saying, well, okay, Laura, but how do I get started? What do I do to drive improvement? Well, you got to start by defining supply chain excellence. In my training, I start by having people draw a supply chain and then define what excellence is. And that's an interesting exercise because no two people define the supply chain the same, and they're not clear on what supply chain excellence is. And no matter how many times we see it on presentations and hear it in, leadership discussions, most companies aren't clear. Most companies have defined functional silo excellence, but haven't declared the ability to really drive supply chain excellence. So then I say, let's map your OOPS chart. And your OOPS chart is, oops, something happened last year. And the OOPS chart really is a chronological critical review where you look at where did your supply chain not perform. It might be on a new product launch. It might have been a product write-off. And then thinking about, are we managing the right metrics at the balanced scorecard? Study your patterns. Do your orbit charts. Do your orbit charts against the peer group. Look at what the industry averages are, and then say, what should your goals be? And then build your balanced scorecard with cross-functional targets. And use those targets in network design to plan by design and S&OP, and then build it into your supply chain strategy and tie it to policy. Most people have implemented supply chain planning without really thinking about policy. What are the right lead times? What should be our target for customer service? Where do we push? Where do we pull? What are our inventory targets? And build the balanced scorecard and then reward people across the organization on the same metrics to drive alignment. And take the functional metrics and look at reliability. Focus on things like hands-free orders for customer service, or the ability to minimize returns, or orders ship complete. Those are measures of reliability. Or in manufacturing, first pass yield or schedule adherence. Or procurement, the ability to minimize quality issues. So you can see that the concept is that you would take the functions and you would focus each of the functions on reliability, and you would take the organization and you would focus on a balanced scorecard, rewarding the entire organization on the ability to win on a balanced scorecard. And when it comes to inventory, we can't just focus on safety stock, and instead We've got to look at, all the forms of inventory and the functions of inventory and be able to drive effectiveness in inventory and look at not just safety stock and the traditional advanced planning systems, but form and function of inventory. So this is Laura, and I want to invite you to learn more, to come to our conference in September, September 3rd through the 5th, where we're going to explore the digital transformation, and we're going to showcase case studies on new technologies. Come to our Network of Networks event in December, where we're going to be talking about quality blockchains and portable data and how we rebuild B2B. And our Supply Chains to Admire webinar, where we will showcase the companies that outperform the peer group while driving improvement, will be on June 20th at 1 o'clock. And this gives you some early understanding of the methodology and a little bit to think about before our webinar. And I encourage you to register. And also, I'm going to post all these slides so that you can see that the industry orbit charts for most companies have gone backwards over the years that we've studied from 2010 to 2018. And so as we have tougher challenges in supply chain, we've got to use new technologies and we've got to rethink the supply chain. So automotive has made progress in margin, but not inventory. Automotive parts has made progress in margin, slightly declining in inventory. Beverages has really struggled on inventory turns due to complexity. The chemical companies also have struggled on inventory turns. And all of these patterns are useful for helping you to set targets. So download this on SlideShare, look at what you think your benchmark should be, look at your closest competitors, start to build your orbit charts, and think about what defines supply chain excellence for your industry. Until next time, this is Laura Ciceri with Supply Chain Insights. Talk to you soon.